everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Life Raft Physical Security Podcast. I'm your host, Robert Value, and today I'm chatting with Scot Walker, principal at Walker and Associates, and also the host of the very entertaining YouTube show, Scot Walker's Protected Future. So today we're chatting a bit about the transition from military or law enforcement into the private sector. And now, Scot, we had a great chat before we hit record about your introduction to the world of private security. It involved R2-D2 and maybe potentially George Lucas. So can you share that anecdote with the listeners today?
Yeah, it's funny. Coming up in the military and federal law enforcement, I was given the opportunity to attend a number of trainings. And by the way, thank you, Robert, for having me on your show. And I'm looking forward to helping others and really enjoy talking with you previously. And I'm going to enjoy this conversation as well, I'm sure. But when I was working as a federal agent, I really didn't know anything about the private sector. And so I went to a threat conference and I was with my partner. I was on the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and I had a partner from NCIS. And so we were sitting there talking, and we'd sat down by a gentleman who had some tattoos on his arms and didn't really look like law enforcement guy, but we sat down there anyways. And he had his cell phone case was out, and it was an R2-D2. And I thought, oh, another Star Wars nerd. That's cool. And sure enough, the phone rings, and he says, oh, excuse me, R2's calling. And I thought, that's funny. That's cute. And he gets off the phone, and I go, what did George Lucas say? And he said, oh, how did you know? And I was like, well, wait a second. He was actually talking to George Lucas. Turns out it was a gentleman by the name of Ondish, and he was at that time the head of security for Lucasfilm, now the head of security for Scot Walker Properties after Disney bought Lucasfilm. But Ondish was really my kind of guide into the private sector, because after that, of course, I had to ask him a million questions about the head of security for such an iconic firm and how did you get that job? And it turns out, just like what we're going to talk about here today, he went from law enforcement into the private sector, and he worked a couple of different roles before he took on the Lucasfilm role. But his transition experience and the experience that he had in the private sector really helped me try and figure out, how am I going to transition? How do I do those things?
It's such a hidden world that a lot of people aren't really aware of. I had Alan Sabella on the show recently. I think he was on your show recently as well. And we were just talking about a lot of people are, especially Generation Z, totally focused on like the FBI, CIA, those kind of fields, anything with the letters, and then completely unaware that there's 5 times as many jobs in this private sector that most people
and hopefully pays better.
Yeah. So yeah, let's jump right into the main topic. The person I'm kind of imagining that's going to really appreciate this episode is maybe someone who's made that jump from law enforcement or the military and is now sitting in that private sector, middle management, or maybe somewhere a little bit higher up as a CSO. And they're kind of realizing, okay, this isn't going to be quite the same as the environment that I left before. So first question I kind of want to ask off the bat is, what is something that you see people making that transition? What is something that they need to stop doing?
Yeah, once they've made the transition, we talk a lot about how to transition and building your resume and interviews and all those things. And we don't give a lot of attention, other than Carlos Francisco, who talks about it a lot and has written about it, and his books are written here behind me. But I think the interesting thing to talk about is, once they've landed this role, how do they find some early successes, or what I call early wins? And how do you keep that going and have a career that you're going to enjoy? And probably the biggest thing, and one of the first things that you should be doing as a new joiner to a company, when I was at Facebook, I was called a noob. And so as a noob security leader, I think you got to figure out the culture of that organization. Because I think too often the way we've moved up in our military law enforcement career or in public safety, there's been a lot of guidance and structure around us. And we just kind of, well, what I did in my last role, I will do in this role, and hopefully that'll work. And that does tend to work for the most part. But in the corporate world or in the private sector, that doesn't always translate well. And so I think we find ourselves doing a lot of cut and paste into these roles and be like, well, when I was at the FBI, the way we did investigations was like this. Or when I was at NYPD or LAPD, I led from this standpoint or point of view. And that's not always going to gel well with the culture. 9 times out of 10, you didn't get the job if you had that kind of a mindset anyways, but let's just say you did, because that does happen. We've seen that. And tragically, some of those people just don't last in those roles. And we have to be flexible with, not with our morals, but with our approach to these new opportunities. And we have to understand that the company hired us to not fight crime if we come out of a law enforcement background. That was my biggest kind of the transition I had to make mentally myself. I came from the task force world in federal law enforcement and had been chasing narcotics, chasing terrorists, and so on and so forth. And then the private sector, it's, hey, we've got a problem with people not badging in, or we've got somebody who's committing, $100,000 in fraud. The players and the approaches might sound a little bit the same, but the outcome is really different. Do we want to arrest that fraudster who might be embezzling money, or do we just want to terminate them and get them out of here? But that's where you got to understand the corporate culture. And if you don't understand corporate culture, it's going to be kind of a rough road in the beginning. You will find a lot of opportunities to fail if you don't figure it out pretty quickly. And so I think the most important thing that I talk about, and a lot of others who talk about transition, is figure out that corporate culture early and often. And that comes through your network, as well as inside the company and outside the company.
Well, I definitely want to elaborate on specific ways that listeners can maybe understand that corporate culture better. But I kind of want to ask, as you were giving that answer, do you have any examples from your time transitioning? I mean, I think you were at NVIDIA or Facebook where you kind of ran into that problem of having that military mindset that just didn't work when you transitioned over to the tech side.
Absolutely. It's not so much that I had an incorrect mindset. My mindset was good. My execution was horrible, in that when I first landed, I didn't realize the difference between, and this is when I was at NVIDIA and I was managing the security team. We had contract partners and contract resources that did uniform security on our campus. And we had some recent burglaries. And while the officers were investigating, if you will, the events, and they were looking for evidence and things like that, I observed that their tactics weren't really safe. And so not understanding the difference between a contract resource and an in-house resource, I took it upon myself to train them. And I would go out there at all times of the day or night, try and meet with as many people as I can to give them some guidance, and not really realizing that does put the contract in jeopardy a bit. It can put that contractor into a position where they're like, well, now you, the customer, are training our employees. You have a dual employment concern. And as well as maybe that's not allowed in the contract. So I had to learn really quickly, like, when we have our contract partners on site, I need to be mindful of what our contracts say. And I didn't have anything to do at that time with making the contract. It was a contract that was a legacy contract that had been in place. But I never understood contracts because I never had to deal with it in federal law enforcement. It was not something that would ever cross my desk. But I wanted to keep the people who were working on our site and who I felt like they're part of my team, I wanted them to be safe. Now, that translated really well to them, right? The human interaction, the fact that somebody would know their name and want to help them was something that kind of took them off guard a little bit and helped us build a relationship that I maintain to this day. A lot of the young people who worked for me as officers or as GSOC operators have gone on to much bigger careers. Some of them are in-house. Some of them are still in contract leadership roles. And I was literally a couple months ago having lunch with one who's now a manager here in Phoenix. And I'm like, when he worked for me, he was a EMT security officer. And I love that, because I want them to know how much they meant to me, even though they worked someplace else. They worked for somebody else. I wanted them to know that they were part of my team. My execution was sloppy because I didn't understand the contract. Nothing bad came out of that, only good stuff. But now I know this is, I guess, a much more tenured security leader, is I understand that there's some legal things, some legal hoops that we need to jump through. We eventually ended up fixing this contract as well by going through a request for proposal or RFP process. That was hugely enlightening. And again, I had some good mentors with me along the way that helped guide me. But going through that RFP process, I got to build those things in that I was like, I shouldn't be the one training our service provider, if you will, to how to do the job that I want them to do. We should be putting that in the contract and then figuring out some KSAs and KPIs that they can, or SLAs and KPIs that they can execute on, and then put incentives in place and blah, blah, blah. So that was my initial approach. We had the right idea, just it needs to be executed. And this is, again, what a lot of people don't realize if they've only been in government, only worked for the government, because In the government, if you're in a branch of military, your unit has everything that they need, and they have all the support, and there's somebody who does something. You can just go find that person, right? Same thing in law enforcement, or very similar in law enforcement. So that was probably the thing that I had to learn the quickest there was this is not like the world you came from,
Yeah. It was interesting there. You just mentioned like the contracts and the contract law and the legal background, but then I've had other conversations with different practitioners that made the same transition, and it'd be demonstrating the ROI to management of their program. Like, why do I have to do it? Isn't just keeping people safe enough? Like, we got investors to answer to. So have to show the ROI to the investors and to the board at the end of the day, or the business continuity and these kind of other concepts that become a bigger deal on the private side.
I hear you 100%. And I would always tell people the company that you're joining is not a law enforcement agency. They don't exist to put people in jail unless they do. And they're like a contract security thing. But anyways, the majority of the things that we're talking about is a company that builds something, or it provides a service, or they're in the financial services industry or something. They don't exist to catch bad guys, if you will. And that's a big challenge. I talked with a security leader, this is a number of years ago, in Silicon Valley, a Silicon Valley company, tech company. And he had come out of law enforcement, landed in the role, and he was providing his contract workers, he wanted them to be armed security on campus. And depending on what area of the world that might work, that might not work. In tech at that time, that was an incredible, what's the risk there? Why is that even something that you're thinking about? That didn't end up continuing to be like that for years and years. That was a very short-lived kind of posture for that security team, but he didn't know any other way. He thought, no, unarmed security officer is useless. That was his kind of view. I think that just comes from, if you come out of that, specifically, I hear this a lot from my law enforcement partners. They rely very heavily on those tools, and they aren't aware of other tools, but they're also policing much larger areas than we have on, let's say, a corporate campus or a corporate building, and much larger populations. So they have to rely on those things. We don't necessarily, we have a lot more tricks up our sleeve, if you will, or equipment in our toolbox. So we've got to learn how to utilize those to keep people safe, whereas they have a limited, albeit much higher standard of resources that they can bring to bear on things. And so anyways, I just think that keeping that same mindset and not understanding that there's an ROI, and not understanding that your company doesn't exist, more than likely your company doesn't exist to catch criminals anymore. If you don't realize that, that's going to be fatal to your career. You just won't exist in those roles with that leadership opportunity for very long.
Well, I clued in there right away at the end where you say your role might not exist, because at the end of the day, you're creating a lot of liability.
They're going to force you out. Yeah. These companies, and this is what a lot of people won't say, and this is a bit of a negative tone, and I don't mean it to be, I just want it to be cautionary. A lot of companies will not put up with the run and gun attitude. I've also heard from people who will say things like they're coming out of a uniformed law enforcement entity, and they'll be looking for executive security type role or a leader role, and they'll say, do you need any gunfighters in security? And 9 times out of 10, I'm going to say no. There are limited experiences where I'll need somebody who's armed, that not very often. That approach is something that is going to be a challenge for sure.
That just reminded me of a news article I watched the other day on a gentleman in the loss prevention side of things. And he was just this big burly guy with like a broken nose and missing teeth. And he'd been in a bunch of fights, and he was frustrated that he was getting forced out of the job because companies didn't want this. Like, you don't want a guy beating up their customers when they show in the store.
Yeah. I mean, I started out in loss prevention before getting into law enforcement, and my heart's still in that world. Made a lot of good friends that I still have to this day, chasing shoplifters and doing things that I would never recommend doing nowadays. It's just a different time, a different mentality and different approach. But to that point, if we are treating people like they're criminals they're just trying to approach us, or they're just trying to talk to us, that's not a good posture. And sure enough, here we are, and we're seeing this in society with our law enforcement partners, because our law enforcement partners have treated people like they are criminals from Jump Street, not trying to understand, like, hey, maybe this person's having a bad day. maybe this person is under the influence of something, and maybe this person has some type of in a emotional crisis. And now we're starting to understand this. And I see this a lot when I watch the badge cam videos, if you will, of law enforcement interaction with somebody who's in some type of emotional distress. And they're actually talking a lot more than when I was in uniform law enforcement. And it was like, just jump on the person and get things under control. Now that, it's easy to armchair quarterback a lot of what our our law enforcement partners are going through, but there is a distinct translation between how you make an approach in law enforcement and how you do it in corporate security, if you will, or the private sector. All I want people to understand is if they're coming into this world is to start doing that translation early and often and figuring out what those tools are.
What kind of benefits did you experience initially as you started investing more time in understanding that corporate culture at some of your early private sector roles?
It's kind of like drinking the Kool-Aid a little bit. Like, really, I still find myself understanding the direction that NVIDIA is my first private sector job. I still find myself following what they're working on. I still find myself excited about the path that they're on as a company, and think still very highly of a lot of the people that I met there and worked with there. And I think that is only because we fought in the trenches. It seemed like, I joined the company when the stock price was 13 something a share. And it's up, I don't know, almost $400 a share now. And
I hope you're in the vested plan, because they've done well since then.
I have no complaints, so to say that. Yeah. We had this small company vibe when I joined, and we weren't a small company by any stretch of the imagination. I think we were 3,000, maybe 4,000 employees around the world. And so as the company grows, you got to be able to grow too. And so part of that is, maybe if you don't drink the Kool-Aid, like, hey, I'm totally into everything that you're doing. Like when I joined NVIDIA, I thought it was a gaming company. Totally didn't understand what NVIDIA did or does. I do much more now, of course. The first time I went and heard our CEO talk, I've been there a couple months, I think, and he was talking about this thing called self-driving and machine learning, artificial intelligence. I was like, what is this guy talking about? I thought we made video games like Batman and Call of Duty. Yeah, no, he was like, this is 2013. So he was very forward leaning on where he was putting NVIDIA in relation to those things. And so you got to understand what the ultimate goal is of your company. Because if you don't understand that, your security plans, your security posture will not support that. And that's where this friction comes in. We have so much friction in our lives anyways, and we'll continue to have friction if we don't understand, hey, the goal of your company is not to do X, it's to do Y.
Sorry to interrupt there, but how would I apply that big picture knowledge of my company's culture to actually get stuff done?
Pull some of those terms into your lexicon that you hear your corporate leaders talking about. If there's a term that they use, like for example, Jensen Huang, who's the CEO of NVIDIA, I won't talk about Mark Zuckerberg and those kinds of things because I was there. It was a topsy-turvy time in 2018, but I'll talk about Jensen because he would use the term speed of light. And for like everything or a lot of things, we thought, okay, how can we ingest that term into our lexicon and talk about speed of light services with security, or we're going to get you your badge at speed of light. We try to figure out how do we bring that into and reflect the corporate culture more. And not everything's going to fit. Some stuff just won't work, which is okay. You want to really try and understand what the goals are of the company. But that's what they start feeding into your own internal culture in your organization inside the company. Because if you're at odds with the company, nobody's going to want to help you. Nobody's going to want to talk to you. Nobody's going to want to fund your crazy project. Like NVIDIA didn't have a fence line or doesn't have a fence line around its corporate campus. And that's something that we knew we could never bring that up. But when I went to when I went to Facebook, they have a very large fence line around their company. Just because they're both tech companies doesn't mean that they're secured in the same way. Not to say that NVIDIA is not secure, but the culture didn't support that level of security at that location. We did other things in other ways. Jensen when he found out that we had cameras all over the campus, he was like, oh, facial recognition, machine learning, object detection, blah, 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 right? He wanted computing to be at the edge, which means that the device as far away from the server is what is computing. That's what NVIDIA wanted to do. When he found out that security had those apparatus out there and those tools out there, we became his best friend. But unless we had understood what his goal was, he being Jensen Huang and the founder and CEO of the company, we would not have understood how we should be modeling our security apparatus, our security program. It took time. It took us probably 4 years to figure that out. And it wasn't something that we were just like had an aha moment. It was, well, let's try this. That didn't work. Let's try this. That didn't work. We're just trying different things and learning from that. And again, had a very, very highly talented group of security leaders, not me, but others around me that were helping me understand these things. And if I didn't have that, my gosh, I can't imagine where I would be today. But fortunately, I had some really good mentors early on.
Well, people aren't going to understand until they've felt they've been understood. All right, Scott, I really enjoyed that chat. Thanks for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thanks, Robert.
Again, that was Scot Walker, host of Scot Walker's Protective Future. I would definitely recommend listeners check that out. That's all for this week. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to podcasts. And if you're looking for more insights on building a successful threat intelligence program, be sure to check out our website at liferapinc.com. I hope you tune in next time.